Hi, I'm Wallace. I'm the founder and CEO of Above Board Financial, and this video is about a question that sometimes comes up with disability insurance, which is, should I really get a disability insurance policy or should I just self-insure? And to look at that question, we're going to use the example of an actual client, a 43-year-old realtor, and we're going to explore that question using actual quotes and talk about, well, how do you evaluate that question and how do you lead yourself towards an answer that's going to set future you up for success, regardless of what life has in store for you. Now, before I dive in, you might notice that this is kind of a longer video. I wanted it to be like that because I want it to feel like we're kind of talking through a case study together in a relaxed way where I'm not like speed talking, right? However, if you take a look, I'm also going to share in the notes where you can fast forward to if there are particular questions or elements that you just want to hop right to it and not see everything that we're going to cover. So we're going to start out just to give you a little overview with the two quotes that are kind of the highest likelihood policies that this client would want. Then we're going to take a look at a model in Excel that actually quantifies what does self-insurance potentially look like compared to an insurance policy. And then lastly, we're going to look at a future scenario and just sort of explore like, well, what would things look like if life did throw a health curveball? Now, let's go ahead and dive into those quotes. And in this video, I am not going to go into the specific features of this policy. I'm just going to share with you a couple of the highlights so that you understand what we're comparing when we look at the Excel model. So, like I said, this is a 43-year-old man who's a realtor. And with disability insurance, your rate is influenced not only by your health, but also by your occupation, both what you do for work as well as how much income you earn. And so for this particular individual, a good outcome on their occupation class rating, which directly affects their premiums, is 3A. And this person's in excellent health, so we would expect them to get the best tier of pricing, which in disability insurance is typically called standard pricing. The words are a little bit different if you've watched any of the life insurance content, but in this case, we expect him to get the best possible option for his health. Now, let's take a peek at the disability insurance and what it would provide. This realtor makes about $100,000 a year. And for that reason, he would likely qualify for about $5,200 in benefits per month, which works out to $62,400 per year. And if you're wondering, why not 100,000? It's because the 100,000 is a pre-tax number, right? Like even though he's in business for himself, if he makes $100,000, the IRS and the state tax authorities, he's in a state that has income tax, are going to want their cut of that 100,000 too. And so this 62,400 is the maximum he could likely qualify for, given that the insurance companies know that normally he would owe tax on his income and this disability benefit, which would typically be tax-free whenever you pay for it with your own money. So this is what they're willing to give him. Now, the reason they don't want to go higher than that is that the disability carriers also don't want to create a situation where they end up paying somebody more money to go on leave than to stay at work. But this number would come pretty close to replacing all of his after-tax income. Now, I said we're not going to go into the details of the features of this policy, and we're not. However, there is one feature I want to call out here because it's critical to our analysis that comes later, and that's how long benefits could be paid out for. So, a disability policy pays out when you're either too sick or too injured to work, or at least to work full time. And the benefit period, which is how long benefits can last for, is often either a fixed number of years as a maximum or it's until a set age. In this example, we're looking at a policy that would pay out until age 65 if he were disabled, either until age 65 or for the rest of his life. Now, you might wonder, like, well, what's that 90-day elimination period? And again, I'll go into the details of this in a different video, but it basically means just waiting for 90 days from the time the disability starts to the time the benefits start flowing. And again, we have, other videos about these features, but this is what he's decided feels most likely the right fit to meet his needs. I did want to spend a second talking about what this MNSA discount is. I'll go into more detail in a different video, but suffice it to say that this is a 10% discount for accepting a policy that does not cover mental health or substance abuse. Sometimes applicants have a choice about whether they want this, and they choose to take it because they basically look at this and say, hey, even though I could qualify for a policy that covers mental health and substance abuse, I'd rather just take a 10% discount because what I'm really worried about is that something coming up with my physical health is what derails me from work. Um, Other times, because of somebody's history, they are only able to access a policy that excludes mental health and substance abuse. And so in this case, because he's budget conscious, we're assuming that he would like to avail himself of this discount. And so that works out to be total annual premiums of about $2,443 a year. He has a choice to pay monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually if he wants to. And then the other policy we're going to look at is the same in every aspect, except it has a maximum benefit period of 5 years. Now, the average long-term disability is just under 3 years. It's about 40 or 34 months, right? So if you think of like 3 years as like the typical disability leave for a long-term disability, there's obviously like a distribution around that, right? The average is just under 3 years. So that 5-year benefit period would cover a lot of disabilities, but not everything. And we're going to take a look at how these future scenarios could play out with these different coverages. Okay, so, oh, and also just to, make clear, when you agree to accept a cap of 5 years on your policy, that reduces the annual premiums, right? So instead of just over 2,400 a year, this takes it down to just under 1,800 a year. Now, I want to hop over to the analysis. So you can see this is a 43-year-old, and he's considering these two policies we just took a look at, one that would go up until age 65 if he were disabled for that time, and the other one that would basically say, hey, if you're disabled for more than 5 years, you're not going to get any more benefits after 5 years of benefits have been paid. However, for up to 5 years of disability, you'll get the same monthly benefit of 5,200, which because we're going to look at this on an annual basis, we're just going to multiply that by 12. And it's an annual benefit of 62,400. Now, the question that he raised was like, wow, could I just save these premiums and use that money instead if I were disabled? Or if I end up not being disabled, then I still have that money for my own retirement. And we're going to look specifically at that question here. Now, to do this analysis, we wanted to pick assumptions for investing that are quite favorable, not delusionally favorable, right? Not like I imagine I'm going to make 23% every year for the rest of my life on my investments. That would be totally wacky. But 7% with not owing any taxes on that is a very positive assumption. To be clear, I would not recommend assuming that your self-insurance strategy returns 7% a year in, year out, no volatility after taxes. It is a very optimistic assumption. However, for the purpose of this exercise, I wanted to pick something where if the self-insurance doesn't look like it gets him to where he wants to be, then it's very clear that it's because self-insurance simply isn't the best path forward and not because we assume something negative about his investing results. Now, let's take a peek at this until age 65 policy first. That's the one that's 24.43 in annual premiums to get that $62,400 annual benefit. As a 43-year-old, what's the maximum pool of benefits available to him? Like if he were hit by a bus, but that bus did not kill him, it just injured him in a way that prevented him from working for the rest of his life. And he still lived, kind of a normal lifespan. What would he be entitled to? Well, from 43 to 65 is 22 years. And we already saw how the annual, not dollars, but we're just showing the quick math here. 22 years times 62,400 a year is that $1.3728 million, right? That's like a lot of money. Obviously a scenario where he's disabled for 22 years is less likely. Um, but I want you to understand the mechanics of the policy. And then you see it going down every year because he's getting closer and closer to that age 65 when benefits stop. Now, let's compare that instead to if he said, like, you know what, I'm going to skip the policy and just take my $2,443 a year and invest it. Well, at the beginning of the first year, he would have those premiums in his account. And then as he adds that amount of premiums every year and he earns that optimistic, consistent 7% free from tax every year, year in, year out, you can see the balance that we assume he would have in his investing account growing. Now, let's fast forward to what life would look like if at age 53, he did have a disability need. Well, if he were disabled all the way out until age 65, under the policy, he could still receive over $748,000 in free and clear, ready to spend money, right? No income taxes due on that, as long as he pays for the premiums the regular way that most people do, which is using his own money. To be clear, if he took a tax deduction on the premiums, running it through an entity, that could mess up the tax treatment of his benefits. We're not tax advisors, but usually doing it that way is not a great idea. However, we're always happy to, chat with you or your tax advisor about what they think your tax advisor thinks makes sense for you. Now, the comparison here is really stark, right? Like if at 53 he were sick or injured in a way that he couldn't work, having almost $750,000 available is a really different situation than having 38,554 available. And importantly, you might look at this and say, oh, well, being disabled for the rest of his working life is a really extreme assumption. And thankfully, that is unlikely, right? It can and does happen, but it is less likely. However, the typical disability leave of just under 3 years is meaningful. And the fact is that he clears about 62,000, right, which is the annual benefit after taxes every year from working. So this 38,000 and change would cover a little more than half of a year. And that is really just not adequate to replace his income if he's too sick or too injured to work. And with 90% of long-term disabilities being caused by illness and only about 10% by injury, like I kind of use hit by a bus as an example, but the reality is that it's usually something health related, right? It's usually something like a colon cancer diagnosis or multiple sclerosis that manifests in a way that prevents you from working, or at least from working full time. And you can see that the math here just like really does not work for investing the premiums. And we know from speaking with him that he, at this time in his life, does not have very meaningful retirement savings. However, let's imagine that he did, right? Let's imagine that he had like a SEP IRA that was $200,000. Would that be an indication that he can just self-insure? And the thing I would really caution you about is that if you're thinking about self-insuring disability insurance, the right way to frame it is, are you ready today? Like if you were called out of the game from working tomorrow, could you retire right now in a way that would be comfortable and happy and aligned with your dreams if you could never work another day? And if the answer to that is yes, then it sounds like you actually don't need disability insurance. However, that's not most people's situation, and we know that for him, it's not his situation. And so I think this analysis really shows that he's much better off laying off the risk that he gets a health curveball in life on the insurance company. Now, let's say that, we know he's budget conscious, and let's say that for whatever reason, the 2443 was just truly unavailable. What's a different strategy you could use? Well, the 5-year benefit period maximum lowers the costs pretty meaningfully, right? Like less than 1,800 is notably less than just over 2,400. Are there some scenarios where the 5-year maximum would leave him coming up short? Yeah, there are. However, 5 years is so much better than 0 years. And even if he did find himself in a situation where health was going to prevent him from working for more than 5 years, having those first 5 years of full income replacement is so valuable in just getting ready for the big shock that's coming once those benefits run out. And so again, 5 years, so much better than zero. You can see the benefit pool declines because you're capping it at 5 years. So, the 62,400 times five is the 312,000 you see here. But even still, right? Would you rather have 312,000 of benefits or 28,120? Right. And to be clear, like if you go on disability leave, you're spending that money, you're not compounding and saving anymore. So I think this really clearly shows that self-insuring this is not a viable strategy. Now, let's turn to an actual like potential future case, which is like, well, what would things look like if he had an average disability need? And here we're assuming he chooses the 5-year policy, but we'll take a look in a moment at what happens if he chooses something longer. Well, if he has the average disability leave, and let's just imagine that happens 10 years from now, if he did this whole self-insurance strategy, he would have, with our pretty favorable assumptions, just over $28,000 saved by age 53. That would cover less than 6 months of his expected earnings. Now, instead with a disability policy, he would get that 62,400 every year for the 3 years that we're assuming he's disabled. And that would feel to him like he's still actively at work from a financial perspective. And then, the reality for most people is that your disability doesn't kill you, right? The good news is that you get better, manage to, handle your condition in a way that makes it like livable. You may or may not still be able to work. But for a lot of people, they do recover and return to work. And for some people, they might not be able to return to work, but they can at least enjoy life, right? Like the people and things and experiences they care about can still be available, even if health doesn't allow them to return to work. And so you can see that in that scenario, the disability policy pay is just like meaningfully more than anything with self-insurance could achieve. And if instead we assumed that he had chosen to go with the until age 65 policy, let's just take a peek at what that looks like if he ends up having a 3-year experience. Yeah, the amount he would have had from self-insurance is a little higher just because saving less than 1,800 produces less money than saving just over 2,400. However, you can see that the self-insurance strategy really still pales in comparison to what's available with the policy. Now, yeah, I want to talk for a minute about thinking about self-insurance conceptually. And I mentioned in the beginning that the right question really is, are you ready today to retire with a standard of living that you would feel happy about? And if the answer is yes, then yeah, maybe you don't need disability coverage. But if the answer is no, then the odds are very high that you need disability coverage because that's that bridge that gets you from where you are now to where you are able to retire in a standard of living that you find comfortable. And I think one thinking trap that you want to keep an eye out for and make sure that you don't fall into is mistakenly assuming that a dollar can do more than one job when in reality it cannot. And so how does that apply here? Well, we talked about how he's, currently working on building towards having retirement savings. But even if in this analysis he did have meaningful retirement savings already, if he relies on them to fund his disability leave, then those dollars are already gone, right? Like assuming that his disability does not kill him, which most disabilities don't, then at the end of, say, like a 3-year disability, like we just talked about, he's a 56-year-old who has meaningfully lower or perhaps no retirement savings. And that's after, all those years of hard work. And is that really where he wants to end up? Is that a possibility he wants to open his future self up to? For most people, the answer is no, right? That doesn't sound like a happy or good outcome. And it's one that he most likely doesn't have to accept, right? Like he probably could qualify for a policy and lay off that risk on the insurance company. So just make sure that if you're thinking about self-insurance, that you're not kind of accidentally assuming that your dollars can do more than one job at a time when practically they cannot, right? So with your retirement savings, those do get freed up if you die, right? Because at the risk of stating the obvious, once you're dead, you don't need your own retirement money. However, for disability, it's a different ballgame, right? Like for disability, the hope, and for most people, the reality is that you are still going to have a retirement, right? You're going to be able to see, your loved ones go through life, maybe it's kids or friends or whoever. Just you're going to get to enjoy that time, and that's awesome. However, it also means that the having spent down your retirement savings can end up being a really, sad and disappointing outcome for you. And so we want to make sure that if you are planning to self-insure, that that math truly works for you. And so we saw in this case that it really doesn't, and that a policy would really have a beneficial role to play, and that there are choices about how you structure that policy to balance budget and protection goals, but that there's really not a substitute available with self-insurance. So, if you're interested in getting a disability quote for yourself, or you're curious about how this idea of self insurance might work for you versus laying off that risk on an insurance company, come visit us at aboveboardfinancial.com and we would be happy to help you.